Ahoy! The New World devs were actually warned about what would happen. I know on this topic I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but I thought this was interesting enough to cover separately. There was a very interesting article from massivelyop.com which mentions specifically this warning, but also other very interesting things that I have partially already mentioned in the past few days, but they were phrased in a very interesting way and brought in some points that I hadn't really considered yet. The full article itself, very interesting, I will link it in the description, is Massively Overthinking the New World Aeternum Debacle. Now, Massively Overthinking is a series on Massively OP where they discuss or give different opinions from different authors on Massively OP together in one big article, so we get different viewpoints and individual experiences and thoughts on a specific MMO topic. In this case, it is the New World Aeternum release. And the first person to talk here is the one who specifically mentions this warning. Andrew Ross says he personally doesn't really play New World, but he thinks there is an audience for it and that console could work quite well for that. He immediately points out that the questions and answers we had following the whole drama should have been released to existing players before even aiming at new players, and I completely agree. He then writes, "What I think Amazon has forgotten is that your community is both your greatest ally and fiercest enemy. By attempting to bypass current players and appeal to new one, Amazon has ensured word spread like wildfire that this is a game to avoid before console players have gotten to really try it themselves. While there has been player input from testing phases, keeping that under wraps really hasn't helped anyone. As a side note, attempting to sell this to the press as a new game didn't win Amazon any points either." In brackets, and yes, we did warn PR how it would look before the Summer Games Festival announcement. If anything, this should have been marketed as a massive content update that would include a console launch. No current player should be charged a dime for it. Heck, a lot of money could have been saved if they used their players to champion the platform extension. Look at all those Final Fantasy XIV memes the player base created to get people to look at the game. He even closes his statement by saying, "The game I played at Summer Games Festival isn't bad enough to warrant the announcement tactic we saw." And this is something I strongly agree with. If New World was just completely abysmal through and through, then an announcement strategy like this would be a lot more understandable. I'm not entirely sure where the whole point about not charging current players is coming from, because current players aren't getting charged, and the suggestion here is that players that don't have the Rise of the Angry Earth shouldn't be charged for that, but I think that's relatively minor in comparison. But anyways, I think the suggestion here is very good, and obviously the fact that they've brought this to the PR team of Amazon before this was published is absolutely wild. When the press tells you what you're going to do is going to look very bad, you should probably listen to them, because they're going to be the ones writing articles about it afterwards anyways, and if you look bad in their eyes, they will say they look bad, and that's what happened here. It's not really worth speculating why they ignored these warnings, because there are many possibilities. It seems that they were just content with ignoring these warnings and knew that the outcome would be as it was, and were for some reason okay with that. With how many resources were put towards the console launch, I also don't believe they would have achieved anything similar to Final Fantasy XIV, where the current player base would have actively advertised strongly for new players to come in. They simply didn't have the time to make enough content for that player base and to satisfy them to an extent where they would say, yeah, we're all in on this. But I think they still could have avoided a lot of backlash at least, or have a lot of people come in with a more moderate level of frustration versus expectation. If you're enjoying the video so far, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. The next writer, Andy McAdams, is primarily focused on Amazon's rebrand of the game to an action RPG. It's basically saying that it's just not how it works. He has a very interesting theory though. MMORPGs and consoles don't have a great history. There's some success stories here: Elder Scrolls Online, Final Fantasy, Black Desert, and DC Universe Online, but not many. I bet that someone at AGS with more title than sense took the exact wrong lesson from that. Instead of realizing, oh, this is a really difficult thing to do because MMO playstyles and systems are hard to do on console well, and there's not a huge overlap in player base, this person decided, oh, people don't play MMOs on console because they're called MMOs. If we just pretend it's something else, then people will play. Great, ship it. He further writes, "The reality is people avoid MMOs on console not because they're called MMOs, but because MMOs don't translate well to consoles and the types of gamers who play on console." He suggests that console gamers are fickle in the way they play and stay with games for comparatively less time than MMOs demand. He He thinks that New World should have focused on PC first, and once that's a success, expand onto the consoles. Realistically, I don't think Amazon Games had that much time. I think they were in a rush to make money somehow to sell this to more players, and I think an expansion would have just not brought enough money, and that's why they focused on the console. So that part would be nice in a hypothetical way, but I don't necessarily think that that would be possible. Interestingly, while there are other MMOs named here, I don't believe that many of them are laid out as well for console as New World can be, because New World is just built in a way where you use relatively few buttons and it's very much leaning towards a controller playstyle. Such a better marketing angle would have been an action-focused RPG, or maybe even use Souls-like in your marketing. I don't know if that's something that's technically allowed, but anyways, something that kind of focuses on the fact that this is both action combat but also an MMO. I guess there may have been some issues with store tags that kind of excluded those considerations. Maybe you can only choose MMO or action RPG, and you kind of have to be between those two, and they figured at least we can express action this way. In which case, I wouldn't even blame them, as long as in their internal communication or external communication, they would still be very open about much of the game being an MMO rather than doing this whole, yeah, we are an action RPG now. To say, okay, it's somewhere between the two of them, and we have aspects of both, but we wanted to emphasize the action aspect here, so that is something that we're marketing with, but the game is so much more than that, and it can also be an MMO if you want to. Brianna Royce wrote a sentence that I think summarizes the state and the atmosphere within the player base at the moment very, very well. She kind of describes the whole situation and how we had this long content drought and everything, and then she says, "Into that frustrated and panicky dead game atmosphere, Amazon lobbed a reveal of what turns out to be a reasonable patch and a way to expand the player base, but it did so in a tone-deaf way that made the most loyal PC MMORPG players feel like second-class citizens with every reason to riot." In context of the whole ARPG marketing approach, she writes, "The messaging and marketing on this was so bad. Unforced errors stacked on top of own goals. I've seldom seen a bigger train wreck, and I've been covering MMOs for massively OP for 14 years. It especially frustrates her because she thinks that New World should technically be a Big 10 MMORPG, but not with how it's being handled, and I completely agree. She also really liked the communication that the devs had for a long time, but obviously that is no longer the case. Colin Henry writes, "I see that a roadmap for 2025 is coming after Aeternum's launch. Will that include the sunset date? Because at this point I'm thinking it should. Maybe that's a bit of a hyperbole, but I've seldom been so sure an MMO isn't along for this world than this one, which keeps showing promise and then falling flat on its face. All but saying that PC MMORPG players, the existing player base, don't matter anymore just feels like the nail in the coffin." And he shares Brianna's sentiment. He says that New World should be a top 5 MMO. He wants it to be a top 5 MMO, but there have been so many missteps, and he doesn't think that it can recover. He also points out that, of course, PC players and console players talk to each other, so ignoring one part of their player base is absolutely going to hurt them. Now, I don't necessarily agree that this spells death for New World, because I have seen feedback from people that are not directly involved in New World's community, and I see some relatively positive sentiment towards the console release specifically from those who don't really follow New World and just kind of find out that it's finally on console and they can play it now. So I think there might be potential. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen. And that might, if they can somehow turn the ship around, at some point also result in PC players returning, because they're hearing from console players that the game is finally better in a new state with more content or whatever. But again, this is, big hypothetical, and as such, I think it's hard to make predictions at this point, especially when we also know that this is also kind of carrying Lord of the Rings until Lord of the Rings comes, and there's kind of the whole technical test aspect there. So yeah, no predicting the future from me, but the fact that one of the journalists here basically predicted the future to them and said, hey, your announcement is gonna flop if you do it like that, and they still did it anyways, I think that speaks for itself. Again, I'm not quitting. I think that would be pretty stupid for me before the console release, but I will be playing some other games in between, probably playing some Taurus Land in the upcoming week, maybe look at some Once Human as well. If you're interested in that as well as any New World updates, then consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to get notified. If you'd like to support me further, you can do so on my Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that, and thank you for watching. Sloth, out.